IFS has a lot of moving parts. It's got ball joints that not only twist and turn as the wheels turn, they actually pivot as it travels up and down. The same with the CV joints. There's a lot of different angles at play here. It's got bushings in both the lower and upper control arms that absorb a lot of the road shock. Now that's all fine and dandy when you're rolling around on a set of stock size wheels and tires. Lift the truck up, put a lift kit on it and some oversized wheels and tires, you got these heavy duty drop down brackets. They're changing all the load on those parts and they'll wear out more frequently. Now the problem with that is you're just going to have to throw some parts at your rig every now and again. But you start wheeling it hardcore, you're going to break stuff left, right, and center. Now don't get me wrong, IFS suspension, it's great for the street. Lift your truck up, put some bigger wheels and tires on it, it's going to ride great, look good down at the mall. But you want to do some serious wheeling? All this stuff, it's got to go. It may seem like a lot of work, but take your time when tearing apart your rig. If it already has a lift on it like ours, someone will give you good money for it. Anyone can unbolt this stuff, and if you put it all together as a package, you should get an easy $1,000 for the whole thing. Another benefit to the SAS has to do with how the IFS truck is sprung. GM uses a torsion bar system that basically twists and untwists to create the spring. If you added a lot of weight to the truck on the front, like a heavy-duty bumper or snowplow, it would sag under the load. By swapping in the solid axle and leaf spring setup, not only will you be gaining strength and not be worried about bolting on oversized tires, but the leaf springs can very easily be upgraded to compensate for that extra weight up front. Burning! That's the second time Tom's put out a fire for me. Now the first real decision you're going to have to make when doing your solid axle swap is choosing the right front axle. Now this is where you have to be honest with yourself. If you're just putting a solid axle underneath your rig to eliminate components wearing out all the time because of oversized wheels and tires, and you're just going to drive the rig on the street, pick yourself up a good Dana 44 or maybe even a Dana 50. It'll work great for that application. But if you want to do what we're going to do, and that is eventually turn our Blazer into a hardcore off-roader, you definitely want to try to find a good heavy-duty 1-ton axle. Now we were able to pick up this. This is a Ford driver's side drop Dana 60. Now that means that the input is on the correct side for our application, and because it's the Ford model, it comes with a high pinion, which is great for when you're out wheeling. It also is from a late 70s, early 80s Ford, and that vehicle already had leaf springs under it, so we don't have to worry about adding perches. We can build our solid axle swap setup to fit onto this axle. Now, if you are going to turn your rig into a heavy-duty wheeler and you're putting the 60 in the front, you might as well swap out the rear axle at the same time, and that's what we're doing. We picked up a good old corporate 14 bolt that will bolt in the back once the front's taken care of.
After the break, from junkyard old to like new, rehabbing the 1-tons. And later on, we'll go for a ride. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Extreme 4x4. And we've already cut all of our IFS bracketry off of our truck, and now it's time to clean up the axles. Now we chose to get a Dana 60 instead of the Dana 44. It was only $300 more, but it's certainly going to give us the strength we need when it's time to take this truck wheeling. And just like the frame, all the stock bracketry has got to go. Now before you just go ahead and throw your solid axle underneath the front end of your project truck, it's a good idea to give it a good once over and check out any obvious wear items. So you can see this front axle joint is definitely garbage, so we'll go ahead and replace both of them on either side. And then we'll swap out both the brake rotor and a new set of pads because it's covered in surface rust from just laying out in the field. And one other thing that we're going to want to check is both the gear ratio in the front and rear axle. We'll simply pop the covers off because these axles came out of two different trucks. They're more than likely different. Even though we only see 3 obvious problems, it's still a good idea to completely disassemble the axle. Check every bearing and every seal. Clean them, repack them, replace what's necessary before you put it back together. Woo. Our front Dana 60 has 41 teeth on the ring and 10 on the pinion. That gives us a 4:10-to-1 ratio. Pretty good for a mid-size off-road tire. Now let's check the rear. With 41 teeth on the ring and 11 on the pinion, that means that our rear axle ratio is 3.73 to 1. Well, that's where you have to make a decision. You either match the front axle to the rear or the rear to the front. And in this case, we're going to opt to get this 14 bolt into the 4s to match the front axle. Now this is where we run into somewhat of a problem. The 14 bolt does not have a 4.10 to 1 ratio available. The closest ratio we can get is a 4.11 to 1 or a 411. Now that's not that big of a deal. Being off by decimal 0.1 when you're talking about a gear ratio will not make any difference when you're out driving the rig in four-wheel drive. So now all we have to do is swap the gears in the rear, completely clean up both these axles, get a fresh coat of paint on them, and then we are finally ready to stuff them underneath our truck. On the front of our Blazer, we're going to be installing one of the easiest types of solid axle swaps, and that is a leaf spring setup. The leaf springs will not only act as a set of springs, but they also locate the axle under the truck. The first step is to build the front spring pockets. Use a piece of structural rectangular steel to create a new cross member. Weld it outside of the truck to make sure everything stays square.
Don't be square. Stick around for tips on spring replacement, high steer setup, and more when Extreme 4x4 continues.
Now we're finally at that point where we have our solid axle underneath our truck and our leaf spring in place. And this is possibly the most complicated part of the job, and that is the location of the swing shackle at the back of the leaf spring. You see, you can't just drill a hole and mount it because the leaf spring acts like a spring. It flattens out and extends as you drive down the road. Now, you definitely want the swing shackle at the back of the leaf spring. That way, when you go over a bump or if you're trail riding, go over a rock, the tire moves up and swings back. It'll make the ride a lot better, and it'll make the truck work better off-road. But there is a specific way to determine the location of that shackle, and here's how you do it. You simply lower the weight of the truck down on top of the leaf spring. Allow the truck to fully compress the leaf spring until it comes off the lift or the floor jack that you're using. Then you can mark a hole directly above that. That is your pivot point for your swing shackle. We'll start by cutting a hole in the frame rail to make room for a bushing that will make it of some 1 3/4 by 120 wall tubing. Then we'll cut the 2 shackle halves out of some 1/2-inch plate. And assemble it under the truck. There are 2 areas of concern when performing a solid axle swap on a modern IFS vehicle. The first is the transfer case, and the second is the steering. Now, before you even think about cutting your IFS bracketry off, crawl up underneath your truck and have a look at your transfer case. You want to look at the front output on the case. Now, this is not the transfer case out of our truck. It's out of a different Chevy pickup truck. If you have a transfer case that looks like this, that has a slip yoke built into the front output, you need to change this. See, with an IFS truck, the differential never moves. It's fixed. So the drive shaft doesn't have any slip built into it. It's built into this transfer case. If you were to go ahead and do a solid axle swap and leave the slip yoke in this front output, it would actually come out as the axle droops away when you're driving down the road. Now, the downfall is there's only one real fix, and that is to completely replace this transfer case. Now, we lucked out on our truck because we crawled up underneath it before we started this job, and our transfer case has a nice flat flange that we can easily bolt a CV joint up to and just change out our front drive shaft. Now the steering, on the other hand, that is a totally different animal. Large solid axle in front of our Blazer came from the factory in big trucks set up in what's called spring under axle configurations. That means that the axle housing itself was sitting on top of the leaf spring pack. Now we've gone ahead and flipped that and installed the axle underneath the leaf spring pack in what's called a spring over axle setup. Now that gives us more clearance for larger tires and wheels. The downfall with that is it affects the steering. See, there's a drag link that attached from the steering box down here to this outer knuckle. And when you put the spring on top of the axle and turn all the way to the left, the spring will actually contact the drag link, limiting your ability to steer. Now there's two ways to fix this. The first is the way that we never want to see done, and that is taking that drag link, bending it around and coming underneath the spring and putting basically an S shape into it. The problem with that is that weakens that drag link. You're out driving down the road, hit a big bump with this right front tire, and the drag link will bend and you'll lose control of your truck. The better solution is to convert it over to what's called a high steer setup. Now we got these high steer arms from Essentially Off-Road. They'll simply replace the kingpin cap on top of the knuckle. Now the drag link will come from the steering box down to the top side of this knuckle, and the tie rod that connects the other side of the axle will also travel above the springs. It'll keep them up out of the way of trail obstacles, but more importantly, they'll be nice, straight, strong pieces of tubing that won't bend when we're driving down the highway. Question that the look of our Blazer has completely changed. What looked a little soccer momish is now a hardcore truck, just by adding that monster Dana 60 under the front. Now the ride may be a little bit stiffer since we ditched the IFS, but now we don't have to worry about parts wearing out. We'll never replace another ball joint, CV joint, or unit bearing again, so that trade-off alone is worth it for the harsher ride. Honestly, I prefer the ride right now. Kind of feels more like a truck. You may wonder, was all this work really worthwhile? Well, for $900 we got the two axles, and it cost us a total of $450 to rebuild them both and match the gear ratio. Leaf springs, U-bolts, brackets, and the steel to do the solid axle swap came in at just under $100. Now that's a total of $1,450 for a full solid axle swap. A good 6-inch IFS lift for this truck could cost anywhere from $1,600 to $2,000. So not only was it cheaper to do the solid axle swap, but it made this truck a lot stronger. Details on any of the products used in this episode, go to PowerBlock TV. One of these, a lifted street truck. Something that was built just to look good. Sits up high, oversized wheels and tires, and they come in all shapes and sizes. Classic pickup trucks to modern day SUVs. But what happens when you got a lifted street truck and you want to do a little bit of wheeling? Sure, you can conquer a few easy trails, but what happens if you want to hit something a little bit more hardcore? Well, for that, you're going to have to make some changes. And that's what we're going to do today. We'll take you step by step through the process of converting a lifted street truck into a hardcore wheeler. Factory bumpers are not designed to protect your truck. They're designed to look good and crumple during light impacts. That means when you're wheeling, stock bumpers get trashed right away. Rusty. So the first order of business is going to be to protect the body on your truck, and you're going to want to focus on three key areas: the front bumper, rear bumper, and as well the rockers. Now on the front of your truck, one of the best options is to go ahead and buy a pre-made bumper like this one from Fab Force. It's made out of thick 3/16" steel, meaning that it's going to be incredibly strong. It has provisions for both turn signals and off-road lights, as well as D-ring shackle mounts on the front, but the big news is what's behind the bumper. It comes with a winch plate pre-installed to accept most popular winch sizes, and if you're going to take your street truck wheeling, you definitely want to have a winch. Now this particular bumper is for a Ford F-250 pickup truck, but we're going to be able to easily adapt the brackets that come in the kit to fit the front of our truck. We do need to add a frame extension to the front of our Blazer using a piece of rectangular structural tubing. Then we'll set the bumper in place and tack the brackets on. Pull the bumper off and mark the location of the bolt holes. Add some tabs, test fit everything one more time, weld it all up, put it back on for one final check before we pull it off and coat it with some bed liner. Now you can never underestimate the size of a winch when you're talking about a full-size rig. So we're going to slip in a Warren 16.5 TI winch. That's 16,500 pounds of pulling power when we get this rig stuck. On the rear of our truck, instead of buying a bumper, we're going to build one from scratch. We'll start with a piece of 1 3/4 DOM tubing bent to wrap around the rockers. Then add an angled piece to help with good departure angles. Add a flat step out of 3/16" plate. Tack it all together with some upper support. And add some tabs to make it removable. Then weld it, paint it, and bolt it in place. With a bumper on the front and the back, the next area you need to protect on a lifted street truck before you take it off-road is going to be the rocker panels. Now they see a lot of abuse when wheeling because everything that you fall off of the front tire after you drive over it rolls up and hits right on the bottom of the door and the bottom of the rocker. Now there's two problems with that. Number one, body damage wrecks the truck. Number two, it can actually get wedged into the sheet metal, making it hard to continue down the trail. So a good rock slider will help you keep driving the truck. Now this is not a rock slider. This is basically a step. Helps you get in and out of a lifted truck. It's made out of thin wall tubing and doesn't travel the entire length of the rocker. So we're going to replace this with a true rock slider. Now, since we have a very angular bumper made out of plate steel up front and a tube bumper design in the back, we're going to tie those two designs together right here with a custom rock slider. A piece of 2" by 3" 3/16 wall rectangular tubing will match the front bumper and be the base for our rock slider. A piece of rolled 1 3/4 120 DOM will match our rear bumper and act as a step as well as a rub rail. Most lifted street trucks do not have one of these, a full-size spare tire. But if you're going to take your rig into the dirt, you definitely want to add one of these to your shopping list. If you get a flat tire in the middle of a trail, you don't want to try to limp your truck off on just the rim. You'll completely ruin it. So you definitely want to get the full-size spare. Now you can go ahead and get a bumper to mount the full-size spare onto it, or like we are in the back of the Blazer, just throw it in the back of the truck.
The rocks won't stand a chance once we beef up the old undercarriage and provide the missing links. Next, Ian stiffens up the rear with stronger springs, and in front, a custom link setup. Stay tuned.
Today we're showing you guys what we're going to do on this truck. We'll completely replace the rear suspension with a kit from Off-Road Designs. It's called a shackle flip kit. Comes with new brackets, all new bushings and bolts, and a new set of leaf springs that can handle the same amount of load, but because there's more leaves in the pack, it flexes better when you're in the dirt. The first step is to remove the factory leaf spring and lift block assembly. Then we'll cut the stock spring hanger off of the frame by removing the rivets. Install the new hanger from Off-Road Designs, the swing shackle, and the leaf spring. On the front of this truck, we've already performed a very popular solid axle swap. But if you want to do some hardcore wheeling with your lifted street truck, the leaf springs are not your best option. Now don't get me wrong, you can do some pretty serious wheeling with leaf springs underneath the front of your truck, but you'll never get the same amount of wheel travel or control that you will if you convert it over to a link type suspension system riding on a set of coilover shocks. So that is what we're going to do on the front of our Blazer. Now we got everything we need to build our suspension from Rusty's Off-Road, and it's their new Builder Series line of brackets and tabs. They are 100% laser cut and CNC formed to fit the contours of the axle. axle. The Heim joints themselves come with everything you need, including the jam nut and the tubing adapter. They're fully rebuildable and heat treated for strength. Now we're going to be building what's called a radius arm type suspension system. That means it will be anchored at 2 points on the frame and travel down and split halfway to create 2 arms to locate the front axle. You've seen us install this type of suspension on Jeeps before. The nice thing is you get a lot of wheel travel, but you need to remember to install a poly bushing on one end of the main arm. So there's going to be a little bit of binding in there, and the poly joint will give you the flex that you need when you're at max articulation. The nice thing is by installing the poly joint, it'll also clean up the road manners when you're driving on the highway. It all starts with the keyed bracket on the side of the frame rail underneath the driver's seat. And we'll cut the shock mounts off and install the axle side bracket. Then we'll cut a length of 2-inch 188 wall DOM tubing and install a Heim joint on one end and a poly joint on the other. The short arm attached to the top of the housing and the link arm itself help set the caster angle and pinion angle in the radius arm setup. Then we'll add the panhard bar bracket on the truck's frame, build the same radius arm setup on the passenger side of the truck, and add the panhard bar with a bend in it to clear the upper mount.
Next, we smooth out the ride with coilovers front and rear. Who needs room for groceries? And later on, we scrap the differentials for a set of mechanical lockers when Extreme 4x4 continues.
Kind of upgrades you have to do to a lifted street truck if you want to hit a few hardcore trails. So far, we've protected the body on our Blazer, upgraded the rear suspension, and built a custom link suspension up front. Now we can install some shocks. Now all the way around, we'll be using Bilstein 9100 Rock Crawler specific shocks. They have a 1/2-inch spherical rod end at either end, a 22mm main shaft coupled to their Rock Crawler specific digressive valving that stiffens up as the shock cycles. Now the reservoir itself is a 2.5-inch DOM tube that not only houses the piston and the nitrogen charge, but also now has an integrated heat sink on it. The heat sink will remove the heat from the shock fluid before it re-enters the shock body. This will not only extend the life of the shock, but it will keep the fluid from aerating under excessive abuse. The front mount begins with a piece of DOM tubing bent into a hoop. With the inner fender well removed and the truck sitting at ride height, the front shock hoop is welded to the frame and the coilover installed with 6 inches of shock shaft showing. On the rear, the stock mounts are cut off the bottom side of the axle to give us more ground clearance. Now this rear suspension is a leaf spring setup, and we could have simply installed a set of smooth-bodied coilover shocks. But just for a few extra bucks, we got these shocks cut for coil springs. That way, if we ever upgrade the rear suspension of this truck to something like a triangulated 4-link, all we'll have to do is add a dual rate kit and some springs. Now it may seem like overkill punching through the floor of the truck to get the shock inside. And on a pickup truck, it's no big deal because you're just cutting through the bed. But on a Blazer like this, you are getting into the passenger compartment, so that hole will need to be sealed up. But you have to do that if you want to maximize the amount of travel you get out of a good reservoir shock like this 12-inch one we have here. Now there's no shock mount inside yet. We're going to build that a little bit later when we tear the rest of the interior out to build a full roll cage. Upgrading the steering, even on a lifted street truck, to a hydraulic ram assist is a good idea to help turn the oversized wheels and tires. If you're going to take that street truck into the dirt, it is a must. So we have a complete kit here from Performance Steering Components. It's a hydraulic ram assist that consists of a small hydraulic cylinder that'll mount to the front axle, a reservoir to hold the extra fluid needed, and a high-flow, high-volume pump to pump it. But the key to the system is right here. This is a 100% new, not remanufactured manufactured steering gear. But the key is it's drilled and tapped with 2 ports to divert the power steering fluid down to the ram on the front axle to help turn the wheels when they're pinned against the rocks.
Next, a hardcore blazer means hardcore axle shafts. Stay tuned.
One area that you definitely want to spend a little bit of time and some money on if you're converting your street truck into a hardcore wheeler is going to be inside the axles. Even if your truck came from the factory with a limited slip differential, upgrading to a locker is the right thing to do, because in order to engage that limited slip, you have to spin the tires up. Spinning tires off-road usually means broken parts. So on this truck, we're treating it to new axle shafts all the way around, lockers front and rear. For our Blazer, we got a shaft and locker package from Extreme Axle Sales, and it will replace the shafts in both the front and rear axle with 4340 Chrome Moly Yukon hardcore axle shafts. And then the differential action will be removed with 2 mechanical lockers. Now, the nice thing about installing a mechanical locker like this Grizzly locker is it's all that we're going to have to install in the axle to get that 100% traction we want at both rear and front tires. It'll sense the wheel spin and lock the 2 of them together, whether you're going fast through the dirt or just crawling in the rocks. The rear axles are universal fit and need to be trimmed to length. Using the stock shaft as a template, we'll mark the new length and cut it with an abrasive cutoff wheel in an angle grinder. Chamfer the edges to make sure it slides into the locker easily. A benefit to just replacing a locker when upgrading your axle is you don't have to reset the ring and pinion. It is a good idea after it's all back in the housing to double check your backlash setting to make sure it's back to factory specs. We've told you guys time and time again, you need to protect the investment you've put in your axle. So we're going to protect ours with a set of Blue Torch Fabs heavy-duty diff covers. They're 3/8 of an inch thick and fully welded for strength. Plus, because we have a 14-bolt axle in the rear, we'll install one of their pinion support protectors to guard our U-joint against the rocks. Converting the rear axle from drum over to disc brakes is great even if you don't plan to take your truck off-road. You'll get better braking power because of the disc brake itself, but when you are in the dirt, you don't have to worry about the drum brake packing up with water or mud when you're running through some sloppy holes. Now, if you have a lifted street truck and you performed all the modifications we did to this Blazer, you are almost ready to go wheeling. We're not quite done yet. We're going to bring it back into the shop, deal with some more power under the hood, swap out the transfer case, and most importantly, build a complete roll cage.